I'll start by telling you that I am an anthropologist, but I come from a nursing background. So my interest in diabetes prevention and management comes from an earlier time in my career where I spent 10 years as an ICU nurse, dealing with people who were reaching the end of their lives and the sort of sequelae of many chronic diseases like diabetes and the complications that come after a lifetime of experiencing those illnesses. And so my nursing degree really prompted me to look at the experience of chronic disease from a different side than the hospital side. And I started to engage with communities, first non-Indigenous communities, but eventually with Indigenous communities to see what the experience of those diseases and of the programs and services designed to support people as they go through their disease journey. What that felt like on the side of people who were going on that journey. And so, since about 2008, I've been working really closely with a number of Indigenous communities across Canada to examine chronic disease supports and programs and services from their perspective. And I've moved into a place rather than looking at those federal programs and services as solutions to challenges like diabetes, those solutions coming from the community perspective. So I'll begin by discussing, just very briefly the epidemiology of diabetes in Indigenous populations in Canada, and then move really quickly to some community-derived solutions that I see as the way forward for culturally safe care. So I'm always surprised in my conversations with other researchers whose focus is not diabetes to learn that not everyone is aware of the particular epidemiology of diabetes in Canada's Indigenous population. So, and part of the reason for that is our information systems for monitoring diabetes prevalence are not that good. And they're particularly not that good as pertains to Indigenous populations. So Canada's sort of chief health surveillance tool, the Canadian Community Health Survey, which we run in 2-year cycles, it's an ongoing survey. It doesn't have a very large sampling frame in the north. It doesn't sample the on-reserve First Nation population, and that's 1/4 of Aboriginal people living in Canada. So we have to use a combination of data surveillance tools to even get a sense of what the epidemiology of diabetes is for these populations. So the last year for which we had data across all categories of non-Indigenous and Indigenous Canadians was 2010. And in that year, the prevalence of diabetes was 5% for non-Indigenous Canadians. It was about the same for Inuit Canadians, although that's measured in a different instrument. And so across a different set of age ranges and using a slightly different categorization. And then for Métis, it was slightly higher at 7.3%. For the First Nations off-reserve population, it was twice as high at over 10%. And even conservative estimates of the on-reserve population placed diabetes prevalence at that time at over 17%. Since that time, our surveillance tools have not done a great job of monitoring the increase in diabetes across all populations. Our estimates now range from 7.8 to about 9% in the general Canadian population. But for Inuit and Métis and First Nations people, we expect that those rates are higher. And certain isolated studies are finding that those rates are much higher. So for instance, as long ago as 2011, Beju Shaw and colleagues noted diabetes prevalence of at least 11.2 in Métis living in Ontario. Natalie Riediger and colleagues have found diabetes prevalence in an on-reserve First Nation community in Manitoba to be in excess of 40%. And certainly Jennifer Walker's group in Northern Ontario is using administrative data sets to achieve a much more detailed and accurate picture of what diabetes prevalence looks like for the First Nation population in Ontario. including both on and off reserve. And it looks like it's somewhere around 20%, so certainly twice as high as it is for non-Indigenous Canadians, okay, which is quite concerning. Okay. And then there are, particular expressions of diabetes in all populations that are extremely concerning. One of these is gestational diabetes mellitus. And we don't have a good handle on the epidemiology of GDM in the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people living in Canada. So back in 2010, an estimate by some Stats Canada authors led by Garner reported GDM prevalence for pregnant people in Canada at somewhere around 5%, compared to 0.5% in the general population. And in 2020, a sort of retrospective analysis, meta-analysis of surveys done over a 20-year period from 1999 to 2019 demonstrated pretty unequivocally that there's a far greater burden of GDM among Indigenous peoples living in Canada. Okay, and so the combination of type 2 diabetes in the population occurring at younger and younger ages, and then this overlay of high prevalence of gestational diabetes among Indigenous peoples leads to a lot of concern over the future of diabetes prevention and management in Canada. And I've come to learn that a really critical part of diabetes prevention and management in Canada is going to come through Indigenous cultural safety. So we have had services for diabetes management in Canada through federal and provincial supports for decades. But we're learning from community-based studies that those supports contain many barriers and obstacles to efficacy for Indigenous populations. And so Indigenous cultural safety is key, it's critical to diabetes prevention and management programs being effective, particularly for this population in which the burden of disease is so high. Okay. So one way that I think is quite exciting is that Canada is beginning to address this was that in 2018, the new revised clinical practice guidelines for type 2 diabetes management contained a special separate publication focusing strictly on management for Indigenous peoples in Canada. And that set of guidelines was written by a team very familiar with the importance of Indigenous cultural safety for health services and management, diabetes management for Indigenous peoples in Canada. The lead author on that is Dr. Lyndon Crowshoe from Calgary. And those clinical practice guidelines really urge clinical care providers to engage with the legacy of colonial collective historical trauma in the Indigenous population and understand how that legacy perpetuates disadvantages and constrains effective treatment and management and self-management for Indigenous communities in Canada. Okay? And so they really encourage practitioners to integrate those acknowledgements into their practices and sort of recognize how their practice needs to change in order to be effective for Indigenous populations. Okay? But I see another way forward, and that is through community-based organizations taking leadership and autonomy over the delivery of care and services for Indigenous communities. And so I've been really fortunate to work with a group called the Indigenous Diabetes Health Circle here in Southwestern Ontario. They're based in Thorold in Niagara region. And so what I'd like to do with the last half of my presentation is showcase some of the work they are doing and our work at the University of Toronto and McMaster University in evaluating their programs and services to sort of build the empirical evidence base behind the value of these culturally safe, community-driven interventions. So I'll tell you a little about IDHC, the Indigenous Diabetes Health Circle. Their vision is to strengthen Indigenous community capacity to reduce the impact of diabetes in their own communities. And their mission is to support communities, families, and individuals by promoting holistic wellness that's based in traditional teachings. Their sort of perspective is that many Indigenous traditional cultures contain all that people need to take care of themselves and to manage their health. And that diabetes is a disease that can be confronted and managed through incorporating and blending those traditional teachings with Western approaches, biomedical approaches, in order to ensure that care and management is done in a culturally safe way. Okay? And in order to do that within their mission, they understand that relationships are really key to effective service delivery. So this is just a very small snapshot of the kind of programs and services they offer, and they divide their services by 3 of the 4 areas of the medicine wheel: spirit, mind, and body. All incorporate aspects of emotion as well. And you can see there's a broad range of services around diet and stress management, physical activity, but carried out within a very land-based and traditionally informed methods, such as the sweetgrass yoga and fitness. The 7 Generations Gestational Diabetes Prevention Program comes within the traditional knowledge section. They also have a large section there on fatherhood and parenting. And then within the body approach, they have a really strong foot care program. They provide foot care clinics all across Ontario. They provide a foot care subsidy for communities. They provide foot care kits, as is shown in the picture on the right. One of the diabetes wellness workers is distributing self-care and teaching packages that do train the trainer for foot care and some holistic foot care events. So, but the evaluation work that I speak of really pertains to the 7 Generations Gestational Diabetes Prevention Program. And that is a program that comes out of the knowledge and expertise of Elder Renee Thomas Hill, who's pictured here, who is an elder and a spiritual healer. And she feels very strongly that the intergenerational components of diabetes risk can be addressed through land and culturally based teachings. So the diabetes wellness workers at this organization have developed a whole package of teachings around gestational diabetes prevention. And their goals are to improve the experience of pregnancy so that women really engage with pregnancy in a positive and healthy way that helps them and their families and communities enjoy the experience. And they feel that there will be positive effects on child and family health and well-being downstream if people experience a very positive pregnancy. And they really hope to promote self-care and cultural safety and healthcare interactions by sort of equipping women with wise practices that are based in their own cultural teachings. And so the program actually takes place as a combination of distributing these pregnancy wellness kits that come in a diaper bag. You can see them depicted here, to pregnancy wellness workers in communities, be they midwives, doulas, informal care providers, or community health representatives, just depending on how the community health services are organized. So our evaluation of this program, which was funded in 2018 by a CIHR Indigenous Healthy Life Trajectories Development Grant, has been ongoing for 2 years. The goals of our evaluation were to identify a circle of carers who were involved in this work and who were interested in understanding better its impact on communities, and to gather a wider group of cultural experts who could inform the traditional teaching component of the GDM prevention program. Also to engage with youth, because the staff at IDHT feel very strongly that youth represent the next generation of people who will engage with the process of starting a family and parenting. And so youth are one of their target audiences. And so we conducted participatory observation at some of their workshops, the train the trainer workshops. We did pre and post surveys with the trainers who had experienced the workshops. And we hope to support future programming, particularly with fathers and youth. We began in ceremony under the direction of Grandmother Renee Thomas Hill. So there was a wonderful event held at Niagara Falls at dawn. in May of 2019. Community members were welcome to come. Quite a few of them were women and mothers, but we also had fathers and other supportive elders and community members attend. And we did a short survey immediately afterwards, and quite a few of the folks who attended were really pleased to be engaged in conversations to support diabetes awareness and management during pregnancy. And we've conducted observation at 2 workshops, one held with 7th generation midwives, a professional midwifery practice in Toronto, and one with midwives and other community carers in Attawapskat in Northern Ontario. I should say that this group generally provides services in Southern Ontario in Niagara region, but it's mandated, they're provincially funded, and they are mandated to work in the north, and they like to when they can. And there was broad engagement among the carers who attended these workshops for traditional knowledge-informed practice and supports, even though many of the midwives are themselves Indigenous, and not just Indigenous from communities within Ontario, but from communities globally. They're interested in learning about the traditional practices around pregnancy care and self-management in a number of Indigenous backgrounds. So that's really exciting. And the surveys we've done indicate that people are excited about greater awareness and exposure to these teachings and to the practical solutions that occur in Indigenous communities around pregnancy care and self-management, parenting and nutrition that are grounded in lived experience. People want to learn these things from traditional elders and others who have that life experience. And I think that's key. I think that's something that could translate into non-Indigenous contexts as well. They're excited about the combination of traditional teachings and biomedical knowledge. And there are many, many areas where there's quite a bit of synergy there. For example, this concept of 7 generations fits very well with developmental origins of health and disease conceptions of diabetes risk as occurring across a lifespan and generations. And everybody's excited about the emphasis on fathers' involvement. So that's very tightly integrated within this gestational diabetes workshop. So going forward, we're going to broaden our work and engage with a wider circle of carers to inform the wider set of programs that IDHC offers and public health programs that are offered by comparable provincial service providers, such as, you know, the sort of, sorry, I'm losing my words, this is middle age, just such as regular prenatal classes that are provincially funded and things that are federally funded supports like the Aboriginal Diabetes Initiative or the Canadian Prenatal Nutrition Program. Those are often offered by provincially or federally mandated agencies in the area, and it would be great to integrate some of these culturally safe, Indigenous-based practices and teachings within that work. I'll just acknowledge that while this is one exciting program, it's certainly not the only diabetes prevention and management program across Canada that is based in Indigenous knowledges. So 3 quick other examples are the Kanawaki Schools Diabetes Prevention Project, the one that my colleague John McGavick could speak knowledgeably about. The BC First Nations Health Authority has a wonderful set of diabetes management tools that are built around this NAME concept: nutrition, activity, medication, and emotion, really grounding diabetes prevention and services in land-based cultural teachings that are relevant to local Indigenous communities. And in the Arctic, it's quite common for diabetes management to be integrated within a wide array of community services. So the Kativik Regional Government in Nunavik, in the Inuit area of northern Quebec, recently funded a new community kitchen project, and diabetes services were absolutely foundationally a part of the vision for that kitchen and its role in the community. So these, I think, are the most hopeful paths forward for diabetes management in the Indigenous population. And as a researcher, I always like to point out what our role can be. I mean, I'm a I'm a settler scholar based at a Southern-based university. And as a non-Indigenous researcher, how can I contribute? But for any of you who are asking the same question, put these 4 suggestions forward. We can contribute by conducting rigorous evaluation and implementation science with these programs and help build an empirical base for these tools to be used across Indigenous populations in Canada and globally. We can learn from elders who have developed two-eyed seeing approach, such as Elder Albert Marshall, and other decolonizing approaches that really privilege Indigenous wisdom and lived experience as guiding principles for this type of intervention work. And we can assist and advocate to embed those within provincial and federally funded health management and services. Right? We can be advocates, but more than advocates, we could be treaty allies in support of Indigenous leadership and control over diabetes services. So it's not enough that we learn from Indigenous community organizations. We really need to transfer control, power, and money into the hands of people who know how to do this in culturally safe ways. And then we can increase the Indigenous representation in our scholarly and community-based research in the area of diabetes. And we can do this in several ways. We can hire more Indigenous scholars. We can put them in positions of leadership and ensure they have equitable access to funding. Those are 3 things that have not been done well in the past, and we can be treaty allies in doing that for our Indigenous scholar colleagues. And we can contribute to training of the next generation of Indigenous scholars who will replace us in this work. So I'd just like to thank my collaborators at the Indigenous Diabetes Health Circle, particularly honored to work with Grandmother Renee Thomas Hill, and to my colleagues at McMaster University and the University of Alberta. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracy. My thought is that we'll have John give his presentation, and then we can have a conversation between the both of you. So are you ready to go, John?
Yes, I am.
All right, wonderful.
Can you see my slides?
Yep, looks great.
Excellent, thank you. My name is John McGavick. I'm a settler scientist from Treaty 1 territory, home of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dene, and Dakota communities. It's also homeland of the Métis Nation. I'd like to acknowledge any Indigenous delegates that we have here at our meeting, and thank you to the organizing committee for inviting us to do this session. I don't have any conflicts to declare. And if you'd like to follow me or see any of the work that we do, you will see it. You can follow me here, or you can see it on my Twitter. And I just really want to thank Tracy for a very elegant introduction to this topic. And I'll hopefully carry on and just build on that with a focus on pediatrics and the prevention of type 2 diabetes with Indigenous youth. So first and foremost, when we're talking about disparities and some of the disparities that Tracy introduced at the beginning, the TRC has asked us to, in call to action number 18, acknowledge that governments, researchers, clinicians, scientists should realize and embrace in their treatment or prevention strategies or research paradigms that disparities, whether they're diabetes or cancer or heart disease, are the direct result of previous Canadian government policies, including residential schools, and recognize to implement healthcare rights for Indigenous people through international law. So if you think about the way that we currently approach through a Western lens prevention and treatment of diabetes, it's individualized, and we rarely look back on the effects of colonization. But the Canadian government, through residential schools and policies and laws, attempted cultural genocide to wipe out the diversity of cultures and knowledge that we have from Indigenous peoples. They tried to destroy Indigenous languages. They tried to ban and make illegal practicing Indigenous culture. And they significantly removed Indigenous people from their traditional lands and continue to do so now. And all of these factors are mechanistically linked to disparities in diabetes and are the underpinnings for why diseases like diabetes and their rates are different between Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people. And with that regard, all future therapies and prevention strategies must acknowledge this fact. And it's not the past. Individual people, Indigenous people in Canada within our lifetimes are dying within hospitals, within the care of non-Indigenous settler scientists, non-Indigenous settler care providers. And children are being raised in current academic environments where we're not necessarily acknowledging these past atrocities. This is changing, and I'm hoping that my 4-year-old son will be exposed to the truth of the history of Canada, and not face the racism that Indigenous people are currently facing in this system. But we can't just assume that this is a thing of the past. This is very real and very present and must be acknowledged in everything that we do. As it pertains to pediatrics, where I work, if we take a look at disparities in health systems, this was a publication led by the Chiefs of Ontario, the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, and researchers including pediatrician Rezan Shulman, clearly demonstrated that racism still exists in terms of access to care. So First Nations children compared to other children in Ontario are 50% less likely to see a pediatrician, regardless of where they live. And the more remote that they live, the more rural they live, the more large these disparities are. And so if racism and cultural genocide are at are the grounding principles for these inequities, then approaches that recover trauma and acknowledge these past atrocities must be at the forefront of what we do. So similar to what Tracy said, the 2018 Canadian Diabetes Guidelines, led by Lyndon Croshoe, provide this conceptual model for a different trauma-informed approach to diabetes care. So framing culture as knowledge, incorporating culture and traditional medicines as therapeutic practice and culture as medicine, combined with the understanding and addressing the social and economic disparities that exist, the effects of colonization, and the accumulation of adverse life experiences are brought into the clinical management for type 2 diabetes. You don't see anything here about blood sugars or the traditional Western approach that's focused on the physical aspects, but rather embracing the value of culture and acknowledging the atrocities of the past are the first step forward in culturally safe care for people living with diabetes. This is a very rarely cited randomized controlled trial, but it validates the work that Dr. Croshoe has been proposing in the sense that it pitted cultural knowledge against traditional Indigenous cultural knowledge against what we would call maybe more conventional Western mechanistic knowledge for the prevention of type 2 diabetes. This randomized controlled trial was done in partnership with Akamel Ootham, an Indigenous community just on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, that has some of the highest rates of type 2 diabetes in the world. The randomized controlled trial offered an intervention to everyone who participated. Half the participants were randomized to an intervention referred to as PRIDE, and that PRIDE intervention focused on the history of the Akamel Ootham, the cultural practices, and a sense of pride in the culture of their community. The other group was randomized to a Western approach to diabetes prevention that focused on education, structured plans for physical activity, support for physical activity, knowledge about healthy eating and cooking, and followed participants up who were at the beginning at risk for type 2 diabetes at the end of 6 months for the 6-month intervention, and then 12 months later to see whether or not the intervention effects were sustained. So looking at 2 main risk factors for type 2 diabetes, PRIDE significantly outperformed action. So culture was more effective for reducing waist circumference at 6 months and preventing weight gain at 6 months. And when participants were followed out to a year, the reductions in waist circumference continued to improve, whereas they did not change in those in the action group. So in terms of central obesity, which is a main risk factor for type 2 diabetes, culture significantly outperformed Western education. In terms of weight gain, those randomized to the action group that were just getting diet and physical activity counseling continued to gain weight at 6 and 12 months, where weight gain was attenuated in those who were randomized to the PRIDE group. Most importantly, though, when we take a look at the loss of glycemic control, or the transition from normal glucose tolerance to impaired glucose tolerance, at 6 months, those in the PRIDE group were 3.5 times more likely to remain normal glycemic, and 3 times more likely at 12 months to remain normal glycemic compared to those in the Western-based approaches. So you were 3 times more likely, to develop type 2 impaired glucose tolerance if you got Western approaches compared to if you were randomized to a culturally based approach. Within our own group in pediatrics, we have adopted an Indigenous model of health promotion that's similar to Tracy discussed, is focused around a medicine wheel concept that promotes a more holistic view of health, focusing on emotional, spiritual, mental, and physical aspects of health, but also engages youth in activities that support the concept of resilience. These 4 attributes that Dr. Martin Brokenleg, an Indigenous scholar who's here in Canada, but originally from South Dakota, believes are the groundwork for all of us working in pediatrics to provide to children, Indigenous or not, to support their resilience. And so first and foremost, creating a sense of belonging and connection to their community or their family. Secondly, through different activities, supporting their development towards mastering their own lives and skills and their sense of who they are in their life. Thirdly, giving them opportunities for independence and choice. And lastly, opportunities to give back to their community through generosity. This is called the Circle of Courage. And this is the grounding work that we're doing, or this is the framework that we're adopting for the work that we're doing with Indigenous communities in a program called the Indigenous Youth Mentorship Program that's currently sponsored by Diabetes Canada and Diabetes Action Canada. We've seen excellent results from this study in terms of reduced risk factors for type 2 diabetes and improved self-efficacy. And when we interviewed Indigenous youth who deliver this program, so high school students that are trained in the Circle of Courage that deliver after school programming for children in their community, they identified this pathway to the prevention of type 2 diabetes. So in contrast to the Western approach, which focuses exclusively on healthy eating or healthy living, which is conventionally assumed to be physical activity and improved diet and reduced body weight, Indigenous youth identified these factors. So living good or living well, opportunities for personal growth and supporting the development of their identity as an Indigenous young person, programs that promote happiness for themselves and also for children in their community are 3 core elements to this Indigenous concept. This is a Cree concept of Mino Pamatsuin, or living in a good way. It's also an Anishinaabe concept of Mino Pamatsuin, of living well. And so by promoting these factors and embracing Mino Pamatsuin, the youth felt that that is how they were reducing the risk for type 2 diabetes in their communities. This program that we've piloted and tested started in a northern Oji-Cree community, Garden Hill First Nation. We published the original results in pediatrics back in 2014. Our first expansion went out to 500 youth across Manitoba. And then with CIHR Pathways to Equity team funding, we expanded to 13 communities across Canada. And with a Pathways 3, we're now reaching around 1,200 youth across Canada in over 30 communities. And we're in the final stages of transferring this from the university to a non-for-profit organization. And similar to what Tracy described, creating opportunities for community-run programs led by Indigenous people for Indigenous people that promote well-being and wellness to prevent type 2 diabetes. So what is your pathway if you're a settler? I'll just remind you that the original treaty we signed with, the original treaty that was signed between the Dutch and the Haudenosaunee is exemplified in this treaty belt. And it recognized two rows that reflected two boats paddling down the river simultaneously. There was no overlap between the two. These are two nations working together as brothers. And in our day and age, in the Canada that I grew up in, we see it as a dominated society where settlers dominate and control the lives of Indigenous people. And we need to go back to this original treaty. And as Tracy described, through research, we can do this through a two-eyed seeing approach, and basically balance the values and the traditions and thousands of years of knowledge that come from our Indigenous partners in Canada, and balance them with the best parts of Western knowledge to create programs that are culturally safe, ethical, and moral for the prevention and treatment of type 2 diabetes. And this can only be done by bringing together the strength of Indigenous communities and Western scientists who are involved in this. This is our Pathways 3 team. You can see diversity across sex and gender, ethnicity, age, all coming together to share knowledge and to build on the circle of courage that was taught to us by Dr. Martin Brokenleg. Within our own dream theme, we create community advisory committees that give us guidance with what we do and take our research work to communities to get their advice, but also to work with them to drive the next questions and to move our research forward in a moral and ethical way, so that we're not just recapitulating the colonial type science that's been done in the past. The second thing that we can do is get training in culturally safe care. Within Diabetes Action Canada, we did a 2-day cultural safety seminar that was led by Indigenous patient partners, Helen Robinson Satie, through the CanSolve CKD Sport Network. They've published their learning pathway that you can get online, and I'll tweet out later, just demonstrating to settler scientists and settler clinicians how they can move along a path towards more culturally safe care. And Helen did this in partnership with another patient partner, Kathy Woods, both of whom are from Winnipeg Treaty 1 territory. We do this work in culturally safe spaces and try to reduce the power imbalances that occur between scientists and patient partners and Indigenous communities, and go to places where people feel safe so that we can do this learning together. Lastly, I encourage you to go out and experience Indigenous culture and make yourself vulnerable to learning and feeling, I would say, vulnerable by being the minority in a group setting. I've never felt more comfortable and more embraced by Indigenous communities as I've wanted to explore my own path towards understanding Indigenous culture. And right back to the very first group of settlers that came to Turtle Island, without the support of Indigenous people, our forefathers would have died on this land. They fed us, they housed us, they clothed us. And I think it's our moral responsibility to give back to them and restore the beautiful lands that we destroyed as settlers that they had protected for generations. And with that, I'll end, and thank you very much.
So wonderful. Thank you so much, John, and thank you, Tracy. Now, anyone in the audience, you're welcome to raise your hand or chime in through the chat to ask a question. But I kind of wanted to get it started with a question that I'm really interested in, and it's for both John and Tracy. To what extent is the kind of trauma-informed, culturally safe programs and approach that you both talked about, how much is actually being taught to doctors and nurses during their training? And, you know, to what extent is this actually being communicated outside of a community of researchers and Indigenous folks who are on the front lines? Yeah, John.
I'll jump in. Sorry, Tracy, but I just want to acknowledge 2 Indigenous scholars who developed curriculum at the University of Manitoba. So Dr. Barry LaValle was a faculty member here, and soon to be Dr. Linda Défis They developed a 4-phase, 4-year continuous curriculum for undergraduate medical students. Linda's evaluating this as part of her PhD, and I'm fortunate enough to be part of some of the group discussion activities for this course. And so it's a mandatory course for all undergraduate medical students. It's, I think, in its 6th year now. And in my 6 years there, I've seen tremendous growth from students involved in the program, involved in the curriculum. And so that's a really, really nice start. And it's all thanks to the Indigenous scholars that are here at the University of Manitoba that got that program running. And I'm not sure, Tracy, if this is also going on elsewhere.
Yeah, I would say that we're at the University of Toronto, we're, making efforts too, but within our Faculty of Medicine, but probably a bit behind some of the more innovative Western institutions in Canada. Certainly University of Manitoba is a leader in this area, but I might like to just take the frame out even a little further, Dr. Mosby, and just say that these challenges are not just around curriculum and the way we train healthcare practitioners. They exist at every level of academic training and research. So, the way our institutions are structured, like the whole process around student recruitment, who we bring here, how we make them safe here, how we create a culturally safe experience of attending school and training to be a health practitioner or a researcher for Indigenous people. We have a long way to go. So I think at the University of Toronto, like I work in the Department of Anthropology, and we are only beginning to decolonize those processes and become aware of how much work we need to do. And at the university, actually the Faculty of Medicine is leading us forward in recognizing the extent to which we have to go. So, but like in every level of society, we have a lot of work to do.
Oh, interesting. Well, that kind of leads in then to the sort of the next question that I had is if you could sort of both of you speak to some of the barriers faced by communities trying to form these Indigenous-led community-based programs like the ones you talked about. And so, what, not just what the barriers are, but what kind of actions can be done to remove those barriers as well.
Tracy?
Well, I'll just say among the few organizations that I've been working with, and the Indigenous Diabetes Health Circle is one of them. They begin as small, very grassroots organizations trying to serve a region, and their biggest challenge is that the funding they can access is year to year, and they access it through grant model funding. So both federal and provincial programs and supports are all grant model. They have to win the prize every year, and they spend much of the year justifying the use of last year's funds and applying for the next set of funds. So I know the small organization that I work with achieved core provincial funding only several years ago. And one thing they lack in their sort of efforts to reach that stage is an empirical base for their work. So that's a role for the research community that we can embed it within our training activities. We need master's projects and PhD projects for our students. One thing they can contribute is evaluation and assessment and implementation science for this work. And they can help build that empirical base that convinces the province, this is real, this is working, this is having profound effects. And they can even do comparative work and compare it to people's experience of provincial healthcare services. And it really shows the value of these community-based, like Indigenous-led intervention.
Did you want to add anything? Thanks for that, Tracy. John?
Similar to the Healthy, I think the leadership by the Indigenous Peoples Health Institute at CHR, giving money directly to community, not imposing Western. So if I'm offering a scholarship, let's say at the University of Manitoba, and I say, you have to have an undergrad before you can come work in my lab, I've just removed access to thousands of Indigenous youth, right? And so if you impose Western barriers to funding, let's say, then only universities can get money, and we can't get money directly to communities. And the CHR's Institute for Indigenous Peoples Health has completely changed that. So we can now directly fund communities, and they can evaluate them using Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous approaches. So I think that's the biggest barrier, is removing these Western structural approaches that are there to build up white settler, non-Indigenous people and keep Indigenous communities down. And so when we see those, we have to stand up against them or work our way around them so that we can ensure that everyone has access.
Ian, can I just say, you know, the other area that where we really need to do some more work and make greater strides is in health services, in primary health services for Indigenous peoples in Canada. So even in regions of Canada where there is great awareness among health service providers for Indigenous worldview and Indigenous healing, where there are very supportive relationships between, for example, the territorial governments, like the Yukon government or the government of the Northwest Territories. You know, they have excellent relationships with Indigenous organizations and Indigenous wellness organizations. Even in those places, the hospitals and primary health services basically run like they do everywhere else. They are biomedically informed Western closed shops, and it's really hard to integrate Indigenous land-based healing and wellness activities within this structure of biomedical healthcare. So we have a long way to go, and I think one of the most sort of conservative, and I mean that in the sort of intellectual way, like one of the most persistently challenging change areas is going to be primary health services. So those of us that have those collaborations like John, you know, that is good. It's a long road, but we really need to make as many strides forward in those areas as we can.
Yeah, definitely. Is there anyone in the audience who feels like chatting? I understand. I never have questions as well. So,
well, thank you for your first step is coming to this session. So thank you for attending. Maybe we can ask you, Dr. Mosby, a few questions.
Sure.
As an expert in this area. What brought you to this space, and how do you feel we've grown since you've been working in this area?
Yeah, I've my background in this area is through my research on nutrition experiments in residential schools, and looking at the long-term legacy of that. And Tracy and I worked together on a couple papers that looked at the ways in which the residential school experience predisposed people to conditions like type 2 diabetes, and the ways in trying as a way to try to quantify what you were talking about, John. I think, you know, when we look at current health conditions in Indigenous communities, that we take colonialism as one of the primary causes of these health problems like type 2 diabetes. And I recently gave a talk at Sick Kids Hospital, and some of the comments afterwards were people who were so surprised. They always assumed type 2 diabetes was a genetic, that it was predetermined genetically for Indigenous communities. That's why rates were so high, and they hadn't thought about residential schools and colonialism. And so I think this speaks to what both of you were talking about today, how this needs to be Indigenous-led, community-based, and grounded in a decolonial model that recognizes the harms that have been done through Western biomedicine, through Western education systems, and that are ongoing through the Indian Act, and through the the lack of land base. One of the questions I was going to ask was about land. There's this emerging land back movement, but I think a lot of people wouldn't connect that to diabetes. But I think that connection is really clear. And when you start to look at the kind of programs you're talking about. Now, a question I'm interested in, maybe other people in the audience are interested in as well, is have you been able to see the impact that COVID has been having on the functioning of these programs and on the functioning of diabetes care in Indigenous communities. It's possible you haven't, but I know how difficult it's been for a lot of programs and how at risk Indigenous communities are. So is there anything you can speak to, the impact of COVID?
The one thing that I could say within schools that we hear a lot of is the food insecurity that comes with going to school and living on a reserve. So schools are funded at 67%, right? So if you're a child going to school on reserve, the federal government sees you as 67 cents on the dollar. So if you went to a parallel school at the local or at a rural school next door that was led by the province, you would get a lot more money and a lot more resources. So the minimal resources that are available are actually providing some degree of food security for children. And so by not going to school, it's really reducing their access to food and access to other resources that come into these really underserved schools. So that's the biggest impact that I'm seeing. But in terms of diabetes care, our colleagues continue to go into communities, and that some communities are enjoying the not having to travel. But I haven't heard much in terms of how it's affecting their diabetes management or access to food or things like that.
John and I are similar in that we work in remote fly-in communities in northern Manitoba and Ontario, and across the 31 remote fly-in communities in northern Ontario, they're all First Nation reserves. During the lockdown period, which was quite extensive, the number of flights reaching those communities fell by 75%. And that means far fewer flights on which food could be flown. And I know in the band offices, in the communities that I partner with, the offices themselves became areas for dry food storage and provisioning. It was just like an emergency. It was an emergency. And the chiefs and band councils were doing all they could to stock up. And that was combined with a really short winter road season in the spring of 2020. And so there were far fewer provisions came in by road last spring, and that includes fuel. So fuel shortages are extreme now in the northern communities, and whereas they typically start flying, they've used up their road truck fuels by September. That happened in mid-August this year, and so these things are all interconnected. So something like diabetes foot care, there will have been no foot care assessments and foot care clinics in those 31 remote communities this spring. That just will not have happened. Dietitian services will have all been stopped. So I think we're going to see the cost of this down the road in terms of complications for folks.
Well, this has been a really fantastic conversation. I've learned a ton. If there's no more questions from the audience, if you'd both like to make sort of a final comment, closing comments before we go.
Yeah, sure. I can go first. I'm 53. I've been working in this area since 2008, and I've been around long enough to see that the federal and provincial programs are slow to change, and that the real difference being made on the ground in terms of diabetes prevention and management in these communities is being made by local people who are not waiting for evidence, who can see what needs to be done, and who are using traditional teachings and lived experience to make it happen. And they're doing it on a shoestring. So I think that policymakers who are clever will acknowledge and reward that kind of effort and achievement. And the next generation of provincial and federal programs and services should reflect that.
Thanks so much.
And yeah, I'm really looking forward to the next wave of Indigenous scholars that are moving through this space that'll take our places on this panel. And we'll speak to preventing and treating diabetes through a social equity lens and through a culturally grounded lens. So I'm looking forward to that in the near future as well.
Well, thank you both so much for your presentations, and thanks for everyone who came out. I really enjoyed this, and yeah, I look forward to talking to you both in the future.